From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hello, it's Peter Kelly, and you are coming into the UK Health and Safety Podcast. I'm joined today with my co-host, Hayley. Over to you.
Hi, Pete. You doing okay?
I am. We're going to see each other tomorrow in a conference. Yeah, we'll be able to do that group hug, that birthday thing, because I missed out last week, but thank you anyway.
But at least you got my beautiful voice on a voice note singing to you, right?
I did. I nearly wrote a LinkedIn message about that and said the surprises in life that, a beautiful South African accent singing happy birthday to you. It took me back for a few seconds, and then I listened to the rest, and it was very good. So well done. Thank you for my surprise. Hayley, introduce our guest, the one and only.
The one and only. We are very, very happy to introduce our guest today. We're really looking forward to a jam-packed session. We're going to learn so much and just hear the views of Amy McKeown. So welcome.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Amy.
Hi, Peter. So I have been in the workplace health, mental health and wellbeing game for 20 years, really, kind of an accident of birth. My father was a consultant psychiatrist who specialised in stress, anxiety and depression. And when I was a teen, he got an honorary degree in occupational medicine for putting in the mental health support at AstraZeneca. So I kind of always been interested in health, mental health, workplace and how they overlap. Spent my 20s running a mental health tech startup at completely the wrong time, given that no one was talking mental health or tech. But I got a lot of experience putting mental health support into public sector organisations. I ended up at Ernst & Young, where I set up and ran their mental health network, which I grew to 500 people. But I used my role on that to write and then implement their UK-wide health and mental health strategy, which was an amazing experience, being able to get something up and running in a corporate of that size. Since then, I've been an independent and I work on all different sorts of things from like organisations like the EU Parliament and FTSE 100s down to I've got a client at the moment of 20 people doing all different aspects of health, mental health strategies. And I now mentor and train people across our industry as well.
You do indeed. One would classify you as a legend.
Right back at you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A massively varied career, and throughout it, you like you said, you had some influences from your dad, but you've kind of set out to really look at things, and that brings me really to this next question. Amy, please explain your long and varied experience in workplace wellbeing development. You tipped into it a little bit before, and what would you say are the positives and the negatives of the current wellbeing movement? Boom, 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 boom.
Oh, good question.
Go for it, Amy. Go for it.
Well, like I said, when I started out 20 years ago, I incorporated my tech startup in 2003. This was not an area. If I knew I wanted to take my father's interest or my interest in anxiety and depression and workplace, but it didn't exist. In those days, the only way you could combine health and a workplace was either to go into hospital management or to go and work for a health insurer. So, the current workplace wellbeing movement just did not exist. I spent the first 10 years getting laughed out of boardrooms for talking about mental health. Stress was a risky word in those days. So the positives are that there is a wellbeing strategy industry right now. We were at the water cooler a week ago and there are conferences around this area and wellbeing leads and organizations doing things, and that's amazing. A lot of reports are coming out now showing the economic value of workplace wellbeing. So the positive is that people have woken up to the fact that actually this is an important thing for people to be healthy and mentally healthy, and that has an impact on productivity and profitability and being able to do things. The negative, because there's always, a shadow side to everything, is that I feel like we've moved away, especially in the last few years, from my interest, which is health and mental health, into well-being. And you can see how this has happened in that organizations didn't really want to talk about mental health. So they started to talk about well-being. Well-being is a very generic term, which basically can mean anything. So what that means is that it's, the world of well-being has exploded with lots of people who don't seem to know very much about well-being, but to cover everything. So we've lost our discussion on health and mental health. And I think that's what's quite important to me is that if we're measuring absence, it's because people are unwell, right? But the conversation is a well-being strategy. It's not about illness, right? So I feel like where we've got to at the moment is a lot of excitement and zeitgeist and bandwagon has kind of created this industry, but we've lost what it is and what we're doing. And especially around strategies. What I see in my day-to-day work is that organizations have rushed to create well-being lead roles or to put in well-being strategies. And many of the people in those roles have pivoted from other areas, which they're great at, but don't really know a lot about organizational health and mental health. So most of the strategies I see are tactics. They're kind of, if we throw enough well-being activities that we're interested in a wall, then it'll have an impact. And unfortunately, the world isn't really like that.
No, I agree. And I've obviously watched this journey with you over the last 20 years. And I do remember when Dame Carol Black came out and I was very excited. I thought maybe we were on that pivotal journey and Dame Carol Black's work is exceptional and has carried on being so, but actually we've defaulted to the cheaper options.
Well, also Dame Carol Black, she became a friend, I'm pleased to say. When I was at Ernst & Young, we signed up to her responsibility deal pledges. We signed up to 11 out of the 12. Well, what is interesting about those and where we are now in terms of well-being is that she had very clear responsibility deal pledges that organizations signed up to that were things about alcohol or varying things, right? So they were defined. What's happened with well-being is that well-being is a catch-all for everything. I've seen spend on well-being going on, bringing dogs to the office, people having manicures, snooze pods, yoga sessions, mindfulness. It's not the integrity of what Dame Carol Black started out doing.
It's interesting because my next question you partially answered because you're such a legend, Amy. But thinking specifically about wellbeing strategies, what do you find are the obvious weaknesses and surprising strengths when developing wellbeing strategies? And I want you to think over the last 10 years because we've many a time sat down at a conference or somewhere else, probably coffee or a beer, and discussed them. But I just feel, to hear from you what you think some of the strengths, obvious weaknesses and surprising strengths you've found when you're developing a well-being strategy or a mental health strategy.
Strengths are that people are starting to want to do them, right? And usually the person I'm working with in an organization of whatever they are, whether they're HR, diversity and inclusion, learning and development, health and safety, there's usually good intention there, which is a strength. And I think there is a strength now that there's a growing awareness that just throwing things at a wall and hoping some of them will stick is not a strategy. So that's a positive and a real strength in that there's kind of the industry is changing and people's awareness is changing. I would say budget, but I think we've gone back on that in the last 6 months towards that. I think a weakness has been and is that often the person writing the health and mental health strategy has pivoted in from another role or has had well-being added to their role because they're interested in it or they sit in a people function. And that to me is very different than someone who has my sort of expertise of health, mental health, and how you do organizational stuff. Now, I would say that, wouldn't I? But what I mean by that is that when people pivot in from different roles to take over well-being, they're usually not looking at it as a multi-dimensional cross-organizational thing. They're usually looking at their role they've come from with well-being tacked on, which means that you don't get the sort of comprehensive strategic approach. And that is, the first weakness of every strategy. And this is literally the first conversation I have with every client, and it answers the question before, is I get asked to write a well-being strategy. And my first question is this a health, mental health strategy, a mental illness strategy, or a well-being strategy? The biggest weakness in most strategies is that people call them well-being because they want to be seen to be nice and doing stuff and all the things you've talked about and the 5 pillars. But then the conversation starts talking about mental illness and absence. And mental illness and absence are health and mental health. And then we get in this whole loop about, well, actually, this isn't mental health you're describing. It's a very niche mental illness strategy that you're talking about. So I think the big weakness is first principles, which is, what are we talking about here? Is it well-being? Is it health? Is it mental health? Is it mental illness? And what are we trying to do? Because unless you've got that foundation in place, you can't even remotely build up from there.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more, Amy. I think whether you're in the role in-house, trying to do it, whether you, to your point, understand or don't understand in terms of if you've pivoted role or not, bringing people on that journey and actually asking the question, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? Because you can write a strategy, but what is it caveated as? Where does the prevention, where does the reaction, where does the flourishing come into it? It's got to be a broad spectrum. What about risk? What about culture? What about all the other things that are already happening in the business that impact well-being anyway? It's not just an isolated absence management or mental ill health side of things. So really interesting. And I just want
where it is, because you probably have experienced this, Peter and Hayley, where you go into an organization and they've done loads of stuff around mental health and tactics around it. But then when I start with what are you trying to do, the answer is, well, I'm trying to increase the awareness and reduce stigma. And it's like, well, what does that mean? Right? Like, how are you going to measure that? And what does that mean? And actually, like, for what? So there's that kind of like a strategy by itself has a very, there's a difference between tactics and activities and strategy.
Absolutely.
And something measurable and something thought through. And then, I hear sweeping statements like, I want to increase awareness of mental health and all organizational approaches. And then you find out you've got someone in a relatively junior role in HR with no budget. So it's like, well, you're not going to do that. And you're not going to reduce absence if you're it's like being really clear what you're trying to do and then being very honest about the resource and the budget and the power the person in that role has to do what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. And I think talking about, what you've been, or building on what you've been speaking about, what are you trying to do? I think the next question is around psychological health and safety and, the ISO 45003 and where you see that fitting into current well-being strategy in inverted commas. What's your view on that?
It's a very interesting question. So psychosocial risk assessment is obviously huge, and you've got the ISO standard, but I was also just looking at doing some work on the mental health at work, World Health Organization things, and they're all very clear that you need a psychosocial risk assessment. It is a question, ever since I started my mental health startup in 2003, the Health and Safety Executive Stress Management Standards were hot off the press. And one of the things we did in those days was feedback how many people were using my tool as part of an approach to stress that fitted into the stress management standards. I spent a lot of time with organizations talking to them about psychosocial risk assessments, but also strategy. And where I have got to is, obviously, if you don't understand what your risks are, you can't then address them. What I have found is that some organizations are quite reluctant to go the psychosocial risk assessment approach first, but you definitely need it as part of a strategy. I see them as two Venn diagrams, right? So you definitely need a psychosocial risk assessment, looking at the sort of things that you're looking at to know what you need to change and where your risks are. But you also need a strategy or program to then enable you to change and make the changes in an organization. So when I'm talking about it with clients, I've spent many times listening to two different, very opposing views, often health and safety versus HR and how to do this. And actually, you need both. Which comes first depends on the culture and the politics in the organization. But a psychosocial risk assessment is a core part of any organizational approach to health and mental health. I can understand why organizations don't want to do it first, but I counsel on that if you've got a strategy or program in place, then that's going to make it easier to address the changes that the risk assessment makes in place. But that you can't do one without the other. You can do them at different times, but ultimately where you want to end up is what the ISO standard and the World Health Organization suggests, which is the risk assessment, the prevention, the early stage information support, and what you do when people are off sick.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Analogy of the Venn diagram, the two working towards or next to each other. But also, I don't know your view, but I think it's what you were saying is I find the psychosocial risk approach helps with the needs analysis and really identify the root cause so you can address that, which is often not adding an initiative or adding a program. It might be taking something away, taking away the 2 or 3 spreadsheets that are causing stress that nobody's actually looking at. Sometimes it's not the big things. And I think that's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of support, there are lots, if in a larger organisation, often there's 3 or 4 EAPs in an organisation. It's taking stuff away and being very clear. But yeah, it's where they overlap, because if you're finding things out that you need to do, one of the reasons I love health and mental health and always have is it's a really easy and great thing to I feel like I'm doing something useful for people, and B, it's always been a very easy thing to get engagement on, right? So I can understand why an organisation, some are reluctant to do the psychosocial risk assessment first. I have always found actually you're pushing at an open door, putting in health and mental health properly in an organisation, and the employees often buy into it. So I can understand that actually if you've got a programme in place that's already there and already popular, then you can weave into that the findings and you can actually make organisational change. That can sometimes be a way of getting through engagement. And actually, when you hear risk assessments, people sometimes get a bit worried. Whereas if you've got a program that's working and everyone's bought into it and they can see, then it's easier to go in. So I can understand that, but you can't have one without the other. Because if you don't know what your risks are, then how can you address them?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to drop you in it now, but here we go. What are the missing links in the world of well-being which organisations are clearly not grasping? Off you go, Amy.
Oh, the missing link. I mean, I've been in this 20 years, and to me, what I cannot fathom, right, and I still can't fathom it, especially given that I can't open the newspaper without there being NHS waiting lists and the Office of National Statistics telling us that more people are off sick ever before. What I cannot fathom, right, is that why this is still not a board level issue. Why we haven't got boards biting off our hands to help them figure out that actually putting in decent health and mental health, and I say health and mental health rather than well-being deliberately here, to support employees is actually functional for their bottom line and their productivity. Right, well-being is still seen as an HR initiative that's kind of a soft and fluffy with a little bit of budget, and we can see that, right, by the number of redundancies of well-being leads, and every single person I know has had their budget cut. Right. And it's like, you've got more people out of the workforce than ever before. We've got, economists that are struggling with that. More people are sick out of the workforce. But the ones who are in, like most organisations I'm working with, have got the highest levels of absence they ever have. And we're still talking about well-being initiatives. We're not talking about buying occupational health, buying GPs, buying secondary care, putting in care pathways. We're not talking about health and mental health. We're still talking well-being. And that's with no disrespect to anybody in well-being. But actually, if you don't have fit, healthy people working, you're not a profitable or productive company. And it should be seen as not a nice HR initiative, but as something that is intrinsic to your organization and functioning. Like, if it takes 2 weeks to see a GP, then surely buying a GP service for your employees and offering it as not as an employee benefit, but as this is how we do things here, is going to save you. Well, we know it will save you money in the long run. So what is missing is, and I think that's because we still talk well-being, right? So siphoning out health, mental health and well-being. And actually, the penny hasn't dropped over COVID when people were off sick and organizations couldn't function and still can't, that actually we should be doing this more strategically at a board level. And if we don't do it right, then your organization can't function because you've got people either at work waiting for GP appointments, off sick when they could be managed at work, or off sick for longer. It's just beyond me, that it's still not that.
Amy, drop the mic. Siphoning out. That is going to be my new mantra. Yeah. That is so true. Siphon out and define what it is. This is what we've been trying to do through these podcasts. Wow, that should be the title, I think. Siphoning out mental health and well-being. That's brilliant. So thank you for that. As always, I love when you get out there and tell it as it is. Over to you, Hayley.
I think, interestingly, we're talking about, the fluffy well-being stuff. And for so long, I've said, I don't like the word well-being because, vocally have said that. But when do you see us, we've come such a long way with safety. And I think when we talk psychosocial risk, as you've said, using that word risk assessment, people might not be at the maturity level to or have that willingness or openness, because it can be quite overwhelming and seem very operational, I suppose. When do you see us getting parity between the things you're talking about, mental health and root cause, in the same way that we do from a safety lens? What do you think the landscape of that looks like?
Well, it's interesting. My next call actually is with Dean Russell, the MP, because I am with two other ex-board members of Mental Health First Aid, wrote him an open letter asking him to amend his bill. So my next call, funny enough, is with him.
I saw that.
The letter. It's an interesting one, right? So if you come from the perspective that mental health, no one cared about it. When my father I grew up in a very unusual environment where, I had a psychiatrist as a father. We talked about mental health all the time. For 30 years, we have cut budgets and funding from the mental health service of the NHS because no one cared about it, right? So that's not going to help in terms of parity. We've now gone full circle where no one talked about it, so everyone's talking about mental health. But I think the trouble is that people aren't talking about mental illness. A lot of the chat about mental health is not mental illness. It's successful people who've had debilitating periods of anxiety and depression, right? Which have been, I'm not trying to undermine the impact that can have, but we're not talking people with chronic mental illness. Mental illness. We're not talking about workplaces being more accessible to people with mental illness. We're talking about mental health. When you have conferences full of very senior, very successful people talking about their mental health, there's a little part of me that finds that very frustrating, because you don't get to be ex-chairman of a bank if your mental illness was so debilitating that you wouldn't have been that successful. You don't get to be a top sports star or this or that if your mental illness is so debilitating. And we're losing in the mental health chat at the moment the distinction between mental well-being, mental ill health, and mental illness. And I think that's not helpful for mental health being made as a parity, because it's diluting down what we're talking about, right? So I think that will be a struggle in terms of parity. So we've got a societally acceptable now connotation of everyone talking about their mental health and their mental fitness. But if you really analyze it, we're talking about low-level anxiety and depression and stress. We're not talking about opening the floodgates for mental illness. That's still very much not discussed. And that's not going to help. If we're going to talk about true parity, we need to be talking about supporting people with chronic and long-term mental illness who currently aren't in the job market or can't hold down a job or don't get in the first place, right? The parity chat, of course, mental health should be at equal parity to physical health. But it comes down to, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about mental illness having the same parity as physical illness? Or are we talking about what we talk about, which is sometimes the equivalent of a cold, being treated the same as, physical? It's a very tricky one.
Wow.
Full of wisdom, as always.
Absolutely.
Amy, full of wisdom. Yeah. And that's not me just telling you, but that's truth. That siphoning thing, honestly, that's one of the best. I'm going to definitely be using that for a long time. I'm going to ask you to summarize one take-home thing that you can tell the listeners that you think that they should know, and it's something that we should be doing. So just one thing.
This is going to make people be very unpopular, but I think it's the fundamental issue of where we are as a society right now. And the one thing that I think people need to think about, whether you're an individual, whether you're working in an organization, or if you're thinking as us as members of society, which is that healthcare and mental health care is not free. And that our health and our mental health is our responsibility as individuals. And I say this because a big challenge of where we are right now in the UK is that we've all grown up with the NHS. And the NHS means that all of us can get free healthcare without thinking about how we look after our own health and mental health. But also from an organisational level, the reason we're talking about well-being is that organisations and boards are still relying on the NHS to look after the health of their people. Right. So if you go off sick, you go to a GP, you go through the NHS. Like, health insurance is seen as an employee benefit. And that societal contract has broken, past tense, but we haven't adjusted our thinking, right? That actually we all get free health and mental health care no matter how ill we make ourselves and how little responsibility we take for ourselves. And as organisations, that we rely on the NHS to pay for the healthcare. Like, health and mental health is not free. It is very expensive. We've not answered who pays for it. And we've also not answered the individual responsibility to looking after our own, because we've always had something there to pick up the pieces.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. And I think you saying you're going to be unpopular, you are the epitome of be the change you want to see in the world. So thank you for your absolute candid honesty. And I think that's what I always get out of these, is challenging us to be better for the workplaces we work in, or the people and the places that we're supporting, is this thought leadership, but also knowing that there's so much to learn. So thank you for bringing that perspective, Amy.
Pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Look forward to seeing you both in real life tomorrow. What a treat that will be.
I know, absolutely can't wait. Maybe grab a wine afterwards.
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
Yeah, but Pete, I know you've got a train to catch. You're a busy man these days.
I'm hoping so. I've lost my keys to get out of the house, so
great start.
I may miss the train, so we'll see.
But to our listeners. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. So, I mean, you will get the train. Every time I see you, you've got some train-related issue. So,
thank you. I just don't have a good relationship with trains. Okay, and Hayley, it's your turn to finish, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But travel safe, both of you. See you tomorrow. And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for being here. We really hope that you enjoyed this session. I know that Amy, Peter and I would all welcome you to reach out to us on LinkedIn. Sorry if you still are waiting for a reply from me. The LinkedIn inbox gets quite full. But yes, absolutely connect with us. Listen to the podcast on all the regular platforms, and look out and for the signposting on LinkedIn, and just do connect. But again, thank you. And we look forward to having you all listen to this next time. Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.